Hello friends, good afternoon and welcome to the EduSat Network. Our topic of discussion today is secularism in India, and we shall focus today specifically upon the meaning of secularism, the history of secularism in India, and the debate surrounding the topic. And for this very discussion, we have with us in our studio Dr. Satish Kumar Jha, Associate Professor, Department of Political Science, Aryabhat College, University of Delhi. Dr. Jha holds a teaching experience of more than 23 years. Also, Dr. Jha's area of specialization includes Indian politics and political thought, public administration, India's foreign policy, among many others. And with this brief introduction, I would like to welcome Sir to our studio. Thank you so much, Sir, for coming.
Thank you.
Sir, I request you to begin our today's lecture.
Thank you, Urvashi. In fact, today's discussion we are going to do on secularism in India, particularly in light of the discourse surrounding this concept and also its working. Since this lecture is divided in two parts, the second part will be telecast tomorrow. I will basically today look upon certain issues pertaining to its theoretical meaning, particularly the way secularism has been understood and debated in India over the years, particularly in last 20 to 30 years, when this debate gained momentum. So that will be number one. But any discussion of secularism would remain incomplete unless one also takes into account basically the historical root of this concept, that how it emerged. Normally it is believed that secularism emerged in the West in modern times, and along with certain other modern values, this was also one of the most important values which was basically given to the world by certain developments which took place in Europe in 15th and 16th century. But I think that one should not forget here that other countries also have similar tradition, which may not be known in name of secularism, but nonetheless the core ideas, the concepts which inform this meaning of secularism, those ideas one can find in different forms in different societies. And here in India, we can say that we have had a very powerful discourse of non-discrimination, or one can say tolerance over the ages, and therefore it may not have been debated, discussed or worked as secularism, but nonetheless tolerance was perhaps integral to our tradition, our culture and our societal moodings. So that way one cannot say that it is totally new to the Indian context. In fact, one can trace its origin to the ancient times, particularly the famous king Ashok, and the kind of tolerant principle which he espoused and championed. Similarly, in medieval times, many people associate the Mughal king Akbar with having a very secular policy, tolerant policy towards different faiths, different creeds. So one can see that even ancient and medieval times we have had number of empires, number of kings, number of policies which basically stood for a tolerant attitude toward different faith, different creed, different community and different religion. So that way one can say that this policy of tolerance, if we translate secularism as tolerance, and then we can see even in traditional framework we have had such thing here. But the main question is that this entire idea of modern secularism as it is understood and perceived today, which has number of implications both in politics and society. For example, it has a institutional also connotation, that secular state, how it can function, what are the institutional requirements. All these things definitely are modern in origin, and therefore one can definitely link it to the developments in Europe in 15th, 16th and 17th century. We will come to this issue later. But to begin with, first of all, let us have a look at the meaning of secularism, that how do we perceive this secularism. Now, in fact, there is a misconception here. Normally people feel that secularism means something which is entire religion, which basically totally banishes religion from society. Now, this type of secularism, understanding of secularism is not quite popular, and there are very few takers of this definition of secularism. Some of the socialist states like a Stalinist Russia, one can say that this principle of secularism perhaps was practiced, but many skeptics would say that it was not secularism, because in fact, if you banish religion, if you do not give religious liberty to people, then one cannot say that one is practicing a secular policy. So, therefore, in fact, this banishing religion cannot be synonymous with secularism. Secondly, this neutrality, the non-discrimination, which is a very significant principle behind secularism, that a policy which does not discriminate among people on basis of faith, on basis of religion, on basis of their identity. I think that is perhaps in some sense one can say is the core principle of secularism, and it has number of different manifestations and connotations, which we will discuss later in context of Indian constitution and Indian politics. And we can see that how this principle has been basically adhered to by number of countries, number of societies who basically have reposed faith in secular doctrine. So, I mean this non-discrimination one can say, or neutrality, that neutral towards different religion and different faith is very close to what one can say that the core meaning of secularism. Now, this before we come to this India, we will have to see that how secularism has basically emerged in the West. For example, in the West, this secularism is normally associated with the changes which were taking place in European societies in 16th century, in 17th century, and particularly after around the time when Reformation took place, particularly the church state distinction which emerged there, that the kind of protest, the kind of revolution, the kind of movement which took place for separating the papal control, the papacy's control on the political power, the state, and that separation ultimately led to graduated to the democratization of Europe. But initially it was basically meant to separate temporal and spiritual power, and it achieved that goal and thereby created a new kind of situation. But it was not only the attempt to separate the church and the state, but at the same time this process also led to secularization of society. So, I mean a lot of sociologists would have studied this secularization process, that how this secularization took place in the societal realm. So, I mean this was a historical process there, and it was not an event, but rather a process. It went on and on for a number of years, and the entire basically European society underwent massive changes, and those changes are finally resulted into number of ideologies, number of the principles for the governance of society and state. For example, you have had the economic system changing in direction of capitalism, political system taking a new form, what is called the liberal state, of course different forms, the laissez-faireism and subsequent versions of the modern liberal state in the West. Then you have had also the entire idea of modernity emerging. The modernity itself was a discourse which basically included all these values, and so on and so forth. So, all these changes were basically part of this process, and secularism was also one of the important component of this thing, that how this separation took place. But one thing is significant here, that in Europe this secularization or the secularism one can say did not take place in in one form in all the states. every state had its own model of secularism. Therefore, many scholars have started now arguing that secularism is a strategy, and therefore, it is a strategy which varies from society to society. So, there is no ideal type, the Weberian ideal type to construct from secularism, that this is a model, and therefore, any society practicing, any country practicing secularism will have to basically stand on that scale to test whether it adheres to secular principles or not, because there is no ideal type, there is no ideal model. It is a strategy, and society in the context of their own challenges have different societies have adopted different strategies. So, I mean, that is something we should also be quite careful to remember, because this is very significant, that if it is a strategy, then it will depend on the challenges faced by a particular society, that what type of a strategy it wants to adopt. Now, in context of India, it becomes important, because there are a lot of debates on Indian secularism, which we will take up later, because those debates are divided, those who basically engage in this debate, they are divided in two camps. One camp believes that secularism is totally a misfit concept for Indian society and Indian people, because Indian society has never been been secular the way it is practiced in the West, because religion is very important thing for Indian people, and secularism acts against religious belief, and therefore, Indian people are never comfortable with this secularism. This is also one point of view. And so far tolerance is concerned, the tolerance can be practiced, and people have practiced here tolerance irrespective of the fact that whether secularism is adhered by the state or not, because the tolerance is integral to Indian tradition, Indian culture, Indian religious moving. So, this is one point of view, we will come to this issue later. Another point of view is that no, secularism is a modern basic concept, and the way things have changed and evolved and happened over the years. Now, Indian society cannot be governed with the traditional framework of tolerance, because now we need something like secularism, secular law, secular principles, secular politics to deal with the challenges, and therefore, secularism as a state ideology is very important, and without it India cannot govern itself. So, I mean, this debate is polarized in one sense. Then secondly, there is also a debate on the working of this concept here, constitutional concept, because first of all, the debate also takes up this issue that whether secularism is in the constitution or not. A lot of people would argue that originally when constitution was drafted, it was not considered important to mention the term secularism, and even if it has come into the constitution, it has come only through amendment, that much later, that is the 42nd amendment in 1976. So, therefore, the original design of the constitution did not mention this, did not give this term secularism, and therefore, what they argue that the later insertion was afterthought, and we have to basically take this thing into account while discussing the secularism as a principle in the constitution. But nonetheless, the others would also point out that the term secularism may not appear in the constitution, and that is true. The attempt to insert secularism in the constitution in the Constituent Assembly was also not entertained, and K.T. Shah, the member of Constituent Assembly, when he brought this idea that secularism should be inserted, I mean, that proposal was shot down. So, I mean, one can say that there is some merit in this, but nonetheless, what we find that secularism as a term does not occur in the constitution, but all the core principles of secularism which are universally accepted today, those principles we find that they are present in the constitution. And what are those core principles? We will come to this issue later, but here I would like to mention that Donald A. Smith, his most celebrated book, Secular State in India. In fact, Donald A. Smith basically identifies three core principles of secularism, and if you look at if you look at the constitution, then you find that all these three core principles are there in the constitution, and particularly in a very significant part of the constitution as a fundamental rights. And those three principles are basically liberty, religious liberty, the citizenship rights, or one can say equality, and the third is the neutrality, or one can put it in the secular parlance, disestablishment, that the relationship between state and religion is totally broken. I mean, the state does not identify with any particular religion. So, I mean, this way the disestablishment or neutrality principle. Now, what has happened that while discussing this, Smith talks of three different types of relationship, and the first relationship he says that it between religion and individual, and this relationship leads to this concept of religious liberty and religious freedom. Now, the second relationship he identifies in name of state and individual, and this relationship between state and individual crystallizes in form of the citizenship entitlement and citizenship rights. And the third relationship is between state and religion, and this relationship materializes in form of either establishment or disestablishment. Disestablishment would be neutrality, that state maintains a neutral stance towards all religions. One can say that in Indian parlance, one can say that sarva dharma shambha, equal respect for all religion. But it is not only equal respect, but also kind of dissociation from all these religions, that a state does not associate itself with any of the religions or religious belief in the society. So, these three core principles which have been identified by Smith in his book, I think they are very significant to understand this secular discourse, not only in India, but all over the world. And we have to see that how these three principles are basically operating or working in context of India, particularly in light of Indian constitutionalism and Indian constitutional practices and the political process. So, I mean, this part of course will take up tomorrow in tomorrow's lecture, but today in fact this debate part we have to keep these three things in mind, that how people have critiqued this entire idea of secularism as a governing principle of Indian polity and Indian society. Because those who believe that secularism is totally misfit, they feel that secularism has created a situation where even traditional tolerance policy has been replaced by a kind of non-tolerant society, and that has facilitated for the growth of communalism and communal politics. And therefore, they believe that instead of relying on modern idea, instead of relying on modern institutions which supposedly practicing secular principle, we should basically revert back to our traditional moorings. We should basically invoke our traditional resources of tolerance, and through which people have lived a very peaceful and harmonious life through ages, and therefore, that perhaps is the ideal framework for Indian people. So, this is another point of view. So, this debate part of course will come later, but in fact, before we move on to this Indian part, this Western part, let us basically finally round off this the Western part which we are discussing, that Western modernity was to some extent became synonymous with secularism, but nonetheless we have also to remember that every Western country has followed its own secular politics, secular principle. For example, the kind of secularism which is practiced in France is different from what happens or what works in United States of America. Now, French secularism is basically a revolutionary idea, because secularism in France emerged after the revolution, and the famous wall of separation thesis, as it is commonly referred with reference to secularism, this wall of separation doctrine is normally applied to France, where the religion and the state are considered two different entities, part of the two different compartments, and there is a wall, the Chinese wall, which separates the two. So, I mean this doctrine of wall of separation is commonly or applied to France, but it does not apply to some other states, where this kind of secularism they have practiced, it is sought to be understood through different framework. For United States of America, it is believed that United States of America they have a different different principle governing their religion, governing the entire polity. It is not like wall of separation, the kind of principle through which the France basically handles its social identities and so on and so forth. So, this way we can conclude that even in West there is no one ideal type, and even if there is some ideal type, but countries have not adhered to that ideal type, and they have basically gone by this understanding that it is a strategy, and whichever strategy suits society, I mean they should go by that strategy. So, what France has done does not apply to United States of America, what applies to United States of America does not apply to many other countries. So, that is number one. Now, this is significant for India, because at times when India is criticized that it deviates from the core principles of secularism, then I mean this argument can come handy for the defenders of Indian secularism as well, because then one can argue that India has also adopted this strategy suiting its own situation, and therefore Indian secularism cannot be judged either from the standpoint of this wall of separation doctrine, or other doctrines through which the other countries of the world have basically governed their society. So, that is one thing. Now, the next thing in context of India, we have to remember that the Indian context, 2-3 things are important. That the Indian context, this debate which started on this issue of secularism is basically largely because after independence it has been observed that there are a lot of skeptics or a lot of critics of secularism who have started arguing that the Indian doctrine of secularism has not been quite successful, because it has led to number one, communalization of society or communal politics. Number two, it has not ensured non-discrimination among various types of identities and groups, and number three, it has also defaulted on its commitment and on promises, and therefore a kind of impression which has gained ground over the year that secularism is only a doctrine for minorities security and minority rights, but it does not lead to non-discrimination and citizenship entitlements in the society. So, this is one point of view, and this point of view is perhaps the significant reason for this growing critique of secularism. So much so that people have started, political parties have started talking about pseudo secularism, fake secularism, genuine secularism, and so on and so forth. But the fact of the matter is that we have to go by the constitutional secularism of India, that what type of secularism or what kind of secularism the constitution visualizes and envisions for the Indian people. So, we will discuss this part later, but before that we have to see that secularism as a process in the society, which we have seen in context of West, of course did not apply to India, because the kind of revolutionary changes which were taking place in Western world in 16th and 17th century, that led not only to the the separation of church and the state, but also led to some extent the secularization of social moorings, social identities and society. But that secularization, that type of secularization did not take place in India. India also underwent revolutionary changes, particularly during colonial period, when the nationalism emerged as a powerful ideology to fight the imperialist and the colonial forces. But during that time, the kind of reform movement which started in India, the social and religious reform, of course, it had lot of component of rationalism and enlightenment values, which basically informed the Western Reformation, or at least Western secularization process, but nonetheless the Indian social religious reform movement were different in nature, in the sense that it did not totally expect the people to forget their identities, or did not attack those social processes which basically consolidated the hold of social identities of the people. So, Indian secularization, I mean, one has to see essentially as ideology of the state, not as the societal process as in the West. Now, ideology of a state, here it becomes important that how a state has been envisioned as a as an institution which will adhere to certain principles, those principles which are crucial for the working of secularism as a doctrine. And here the secularism as an ideology becomes important, not secularism as a social process. Now, the third thing is the secularism as tradition, which a lot of people still argue that India, without looking toward the West or without borrowing anything from West, has from the very beginning practiced secularism, and that tolerance is India's traditional value, and these resources are still available, and those resources can be tapped, invoked, and can be mobilized to create a more peaceful, tolerant, harmonious society without reference to this principle of secularism as an ideology of the state, which has basically defaulted on its promise and commitment. So, I mean, this is the third dimension. The fourth dimension is that secularism, not as ideology of a state, but secularism as a policy of the state, has always been there in India, and it is here that examples are cited from ancient, medieval, and number of principalities, empires, and so on and so forth. And to just show this point, that how India has always practiced secularism, secular policy, even if the ideology of state may not have been secular, but nonetheless the policy of a state was quite secular, non-discriminatory, and tolerant toward everyone. And it is here that the example of the Buddhist king Akbar and the Muslim king, the Buddhist king Ashoka and the Muslim king Akbar are cited, that these two figures from ancient the medieval times, one from the Mauryan Empire and another from the Mughal Empire, how they practiced a secular principle without essentially establishing a secular state the way it is perceived today. So, not as an ideology of a state, but as the policy of the state. So, these 3-4 issues one can basically figure out that they loom large on any debate which surrounds this secularism in Indian context. So, basically we will take up, or we will have some discussion of these issues later. Now, coming to this issue of secularism, the debate regarding secularism, before we come to this working of this secularism, this debate has basically gained momentum in 80s, and there are many factors for this, but the most important factor was that a kind of disillusionment which took place among the people, and particularly in academia one can see that why India as a secular state is not being able to deliver on its commitment of a non-discriminatory and a very tolerant and a kind of tolerant society, particularly this non-discriminatory, that why it is not ensuring non-discrimination. A number of issues were responsible for this. Now, this debate in academics which started were mostly by a group of social scientists, political scientists, social psychologists, historians, philosophers, and so on and so forth, who have been known as alternativists, because they wanted to construct an alternative modernity, or one can say they want to construct an alternative worldview for India, which is different from the West, because they believe that Indian society is essentially different from the West, therefore, Indian society deserves a different framework. Now, this type of framework to look at secularism was initially was basically given by a social psychologist, and he is Ashish Nandi. In fact, in early 80s, he wrote a very famous paper, Anti-Secular Manifesto, and in that paper he argued very forcefully that how India does not require this modern secularism of Western variety, because India can do better without this secularism, and how India can do better, that then he gave number of instances and examples from day to day life, from everyday life, from popular culture, and then he wanted to establish that traditionally Indian society has been secular, has been tolerant, there was no instance of communal conflict, there was no instance of any violence. It is only because of these modern institutions and modern concepts that Indian, the violence, the kind of harmonious and syncretic fabric of Indian society have been disturbed, and secularism perhaps in his opinion is the main culprit. So, therefore, it should be banished as the state ideology, because people can manage their affairs better with the help of their traditional resources. So, this was Ashish Nandi, and he basically triggered this debate, one can say. But later many others joined, and the sociologist T. N. Madan in his paper in Journal of Asian Studies in 87, that was also a major intervention in this debate, because Madan also argued that secularism as a state principle is totally inapt and inappropriate for India. Now, later in 90s, when number of developments were taking place in social science, particularly communitarianism, postmodernism and so on and so forth, some subaltern scholars, particularly one political scientist, Partha Chatterjee, he wrote a very interesting paper and in secularism and tolerance, and then in that paper he also argued that secularism is not being able to manage the affairs in the civil society, and therefore this tolerance, now one has to look for the resources in the civil society itself, that how it can be done, because in his opinion that it is basically faltering on its promise, on its commitment. So, I mean, this debate in a different form, one can say that in 80s and 90s have been an important reference point for any discussion on secularism. But this debate one can say is a debate from the point of view of skepticism, that secularism is not being able to help Indian state to govern Indian society, and therefore, we should look for some alternative. But then there is another side of this debate, where people believe that without secularism India cannot manage its affairs, and it is also not proper to pass a judgment on basically success or failure of Indian secularism, because every secular state has its own strategy, and India has also its own strategy. Therefore, it is always advisable to judge the success or failure of Indian secularism on basis of the strategy enshrined in the constitution, rather than simply going by certain ideal types or certain ideal frameworks through which one can judge the working of Indian secular politics. So, I mean, this argument has been forcefully put forth by political scientist Rajiv Bhargav, and he also edited a book, Secularism and its Critics, and over the years he has been writing along this line. And he feels that it is a strategy, and every society, every country has devised its own strategy. So is the case with India. India has also devised its strategy, and that strategy in fact then he also basically gives certain core values of secularism, and one can then he argues that one has to see that whether a strategy is based on these core values or not, and those core values his core values translate into three things: liberty, equality and fraternity. Fraternity stands for tolerance here, and liberty, religious liberty, and equality. And then he also argues that all these values have to be ensured with the help of the secular polity, and there is a possibility of trade off also among these values, that, and even the state intervention is permissible if it is meant to basically enforce these values. But when it comes to the prioritization of these values, that which value is more important, that for enforcing which value the state can intervene, if there is a conflict among these three values, that is liberty, equality and fraternity, then which value will be privileged. So, these issues are also basically handled by him, and he argues that it is a contextual thing, doctrine. So, context is specific, but all these values have to be seen in context of the overall mission to establish a democratic citizenship. And if it is leading to that destination, if it is leading to that mission of establishment of a democratic citizenship, then any state intervention in religious matter is permissible. And therefore, this disestablishment thing is also negotiable, that a state can not totally get disconnected from the religion, rather it can intervene in a particular religious group if it is meant to secure these values. So, I mean, this is interesting argument, interesting framework coming from a political scientist, Rajiv Bhargava, who over the years has written consistently on secularism and the debate surrounding the secularism. Now, apart from Rajiv Bhargava, there is another person who is very significant for understanding secular politics and secularism as an ideology of a state, and he is Donald E. Smith. Now, his book Secular State in India, published in 60s, is still considered a classic work, in the sense that it was a time when only a decade had passed of the establishment of Indian Republic, and Smith, while looking at the broad framework, broad contours of secular polity, both with the help of the constitution and with the help of the working of this constitution in one decade or so, tried to give a coherent framework to understand Indian secularism and secular doctrine in India. Now, as I mentioned earlier, that Smith talked of three different types of relationship. The first is religion and individual, and this is the relationship which leads to freedom of religion or religious liberty, which is very important. As I mentioned earlier, that any state which totally banishes religion is normally not considered a secular state. So, I mean, entire religion is not synonymous with secularism, but secularism stands for religious liberty of the people. But this is also something which is very complex, because religious liberty, how this liberty has to be ensured and maintained in a manner that it doesn't infringe on the similar liberties of the others. So, I mean, this is a kind of, on the one hand, a state has to maintain a distance from religion, on the other hand it has to ensure religious liberty, and therefore, this balance is quite delicate, that how this religious liberty not for one group, one section of society, but all sections without any sense of discrimination. So, here the secular state walks on a very tight rope, and it is here that most of the criticisms it attracts in different countries where it is in operation. So, I mean, this is religion and individual. The second is the state and individual. The state deals with its individual, and it is well known that individuals have different markers, social markers, different identities. They are not without identities and markers. So, how the state deals with its own citizens? In other words, one can say that how a state deals with different social identities. Now, in context of what is happening in France recently, it has been rightly argued that secularism is less about religious neutrality, state neutrality toward religion, rather more about dealing with the social identities, that how a state deals with social identity. So, I mean, this is the citizenship aspect, and it is here that how a state can intervene to ensure that those people who are oppressed, who are discriminated, they are freed from the discriminated situation, and they attain the citizenship entitlements. So, this is another very delicate area, and it is here that Indian secularism has also been criticized. We will take up this issue tomorrow. For example, a lot of people believe that in order to ensure citizenship entitlements, the kind of positive discrimination which Indian state adopts at times leads to a kind of discrimination rather than creating a non-discriminatory society. So, this positive discrimination comes here as a handle for many critics to attack Indian secularism, though it is to be borne in mind that positive discrimination is meant to create a non-discriminatory society. Therefore, secularism and social justice both were spoken in the same breath by the Indian constitution. Therefore, article 15 and 16 are so coterminous, they are so close to each other. So, I mean this is there, but nonetheless it is also like the first one, the religious liberty is a very delicate area, and the state has to tread very cautiously. The third is the state and religion. Now, state and religion relationship is also as contentious as the first two, because how the state can deal with religion, particularly in a society which is multi-religious, where there is no homogeneity in terms of social identities, where there are plurality of belief system, where there is a kind of multicultural situation. How the state would deal with different religions, what kind of distance it will maintain. Now, the thing is that it is this relationship between a state and religion which leads to this either establishment or disestablishment. Now, secular doctrine stands for disestablishment, that a state and religion are separated. Now, this wall of separation doctrine which we were discussing in context of France emerges from this principle. Now, there are different ways to deal with religion. United States of America's principle is different from the France. Now, sometimes there is one way separation, sometimes there is a both ways separation. So, all these things come from this third relationship, state and religion. Now, here also Indian secular framework is often taken to task, because it is believed that in India what has happened that a state has not been able to maintain a distance from different religions. The kind of intervention it makes in different religions or the matters pertaining to religion, that does not augur well for secular polity. Here examples are given from the state interference in temples management, then state kind of patronage to certain minorities, particularly promoting some of their activities, religious activities. So, all these things are there, and then it is argued that this type of interference in religious matter does not imply disestablishment, rather it brings state closer to religion. But then it is also argued that in India the context has been as such that a state had to intervene, because India some of the religions did not have that organized structure like the West, and therefore, those religions were not in a position to manage their own affairs properly. So, a state had to intervene to create a situation where secular principles are basically enforced. So, in order to enforce secular principle, a state had to intervene, particularly the management of temples and so on and so forth. Similarly, promoting Hajj and other activities, they are also referred as an example of this deviation from this principle, but here again it is argued that this is also context specific in order to promote certain minorities, because promoting minority and their rights is also a constitutional responsibility of the state. So, this is something what Smith has tried to argue in his book Secular State in India. Now, these three principles which I have just mentioned, the liberty, religion and individual, state and individual, and state and religion, all these three principles can be put under category of liberty, equality and neutrality. The disestablishment basically becomes neutrality. So, these things have been judged by Smith, have been assessed, have been studied in context of India in a very detailed fashion in this book, and we will basically come to this issue tomorrow when we will discuss this constitutional provision. Now, before I move to the next section, I mean this is also important to remember that the relationship between nationalism and secularism, and it is here that Indian discourse of secularism becomes important also, because one of the criticism of secularism in India is that in name of championing basically nationalism of particular type, what has happened that secularism has become synonymous with nationalism, and nationalism at times is hijacked by the majority groups in the society, and therefore the secularism loses its own autonomous identity, and therefore it fails as an ideology of the state. Now, this secular nationalism, or I mean the kind of relationship between secularism and nationalism which is materialized in India, has a historical context. For example, as many of us are aware that how Indian National Congress started an organization to fight colonial rule in India, and how that organization was tasked with the responsibility to create to forge a nation in India, because it was also a difficult job to forge nationhood in India, where there was not one religion, one language, one identity, but it was characterized by multicultural and multi-ethnic societies. Therefore, this nationalism early on was perceived to be a difficult project, and the first formative years what we find that the nationalists, the first generation of nationalists after the formation of Congress, who are known as moderates, they started envisioning a secular nationalism in India, that nationalism which would basically incorporate different identities without associating itself with any group. And therefore, when the Indian National Congress was formed in 1885, immediately after 3 years of its formation, it passed two important resolutions, and one resolution was that it would not adopt any it would not pass any resolution, or it would not adopt any policy which will be opposed by the majority of the Muslims or majority of the Hindus, meaning thereby that if anything is opposed by these two important groups in the society, then the Congress will drop that agenda, because that means that the moment it is opposed by majority of one section which matters, or both sections, then it will not have the same legitimacy, which perhaps can gradually also result into the erosion of the legitimacy of this entire nationalist politics. So, I mean this way they started, and they wanted to basically force this new identity of nation on basis of republican values, the democratic values, liberty, equality and justice, not on basis of linguistic affinity or religious identity the way it was done elsewhere in the world. So, secular nationalism therefore was the important development at that time, and along with nationalism, secularism also became important principle of this discourse. Now, gradually of course, there were many ups and downs, there were many deviations. I mean it is not possible here to go into those details, but what happened that it kept on it was refined further, it graduated to a higher level of perfection, and therefore, what we find that 1931 the Karachi Congress, when Karachi Congress passed a very elaborate resolution on fundamental rights, one finds that secularism as a principle, particularly the core principles of secularism, one finds that are getting incorporated into the Karachi resolution, which subsequently became part of the Indian constitutionalism. So, I mean this way one can say that this nationalism and secularism bonding, the kind of relationship which was forged here in context of colonial situation, was a significant move on the part of the the political elites, who knew that only through a secular principle that the modern India can be managed and governed. Therefore, those critics who believe that now we can still manage our affairs with the help of the resources available in tradition and we can invoke the past, I think they should do well to remember that how Indian national movement basically factored in different issues, and finally they realized that the Indian situation now is different from what India was earlier. Therefore, they considered secularism to be integral to this nationalist project, that unless Indian nation becomes secular in its appearance, I think this will not have a very sturdy standing. So, I mean, this way one finds this nationalism and secularism issues getting connected. Now, of course, we have seen the critiques even at that time, and therefore, the most dominant critique was from the Muslim League, and we have seen that how this two nation theory emerged and how that led to the partition of India. Even on issue of caste and secularism, number of interrogations took place, and for example, the major interrogation was done by Ambedkar, one of the most important thinker of modern times. And Ambedkar, the way when he interrogated this nationhood, when he interrogated the kind of secular nationalism which was being championed by Congress, it also had lot of significance. And therefore, what we find that when the constitution was being drafted, all these concerns, all these issues were sought to be addressed. Whether they were addressed properly or not, that is a different matter of debate, but one cannot deny that attempt was made to incorporate these issues. Now, what happened that when the Constituent Assembly met and the constitution was being drafted, we have seen that situation was different, because it was not possible at that time to straight away incorporate this principle of secularism in the constitution, at least the way it is being talked about today. Though the principles entered, but the term, as I mentioned earlier also, that one member of the Constituent Assembly, K.T. Shah, proposed that it should be incorporated and mentioned in the constitution, but it was not considered prudent to do that. Now, there are number of there are different point of views on this, but one thing is significant here which we should remember, that there were some princely estates which were not secular states, rather they were very close to what we call theocratic states, and some of the states were in the southern part of India, and their integration was also on the agenda, and it was difficult to convince them, persuade them to get integrated in India within a kind of within a polity in which the constitution was declaring itself to be secular. So, I mean, initially it was not considered prudent till the final integration of these princely estates were concerned. So, secularism had many roadblocks, but still we can see that it was somehow the Constituent Assembly managed to incorporate all the core principles of secularism in the constitution, without of course not mentioning it either in the preamble or any part of the constitution. Here the most important and most significant part of the constitution is the fundamental rights section. And if you look at the fundamental rights of the constitution, that is chapter third part of the constitution, you find that one finds that all these three principles which have been underlined and emphasized by Donald Smith, they find place in the constitution. This is religious liberty, that is why you have article 25, then you have citizenship, and here one can mention article 15.1, 15.4, in fact 16, and so on and so forth. So, basically of course, the 15.4 was inserted by the first amendment, but 15.1 one can mention here. Then you have 335, SCs and STs and the provisions dealing with them. Then the provisions 340. So, in fact this all these provisions tell us that how this Constituent Assembly was concerned to basically ensure citizenship entitlements irrespective of the social marker or in order to end the discrimination in society, they wanted to create a non-discriminatory framework, and for creating a non-discriminatory framework, they wanted positive discrimination, so that everyone, irrespective of their social origin and social background, enjoys social citizenship rights. And the third, this disestablishment, that is the separation of state and religion, we also find that coming in a big way. For example, Article 27, when taxation is prohibited, particularly taxation to any religion, taxation the proceeds from the tax being used for any religious group. Similarly, no religious instruction in schools. So, all these things were meant to create a kind of neutral, impartial state, what we have discussed in form of disestablishment principle. So, one can say that Indian constitution, without using the word secularism, incorporated all the core principles of the constitution of the secularism, and fundamental rights section of the constitution is the best example of this doctrine. Now, the next part is this working of the constitution and the secular debate, that how it has worked, and on basis of that how people have critiqued it, and what is the overall assessment of secularism in India. This part I will take up tomorrow.
Right, thank you so much, sir. So friends, today we have discussed with sir the idea of secularism in India. We have looked at the meaning, history, and also the debate around it, and of course sir has also talked a bit about what he is going to discuss tomorrow. So friends, just very briefly I would like to ask sir, in order to say prepare or understand better the next lecture, could we look at some notes or some kind of books?
Yeah, in fact there are 2-3 books which are very useful to take stock of the entire debate which has taken place around this idea of secularism. One is the Handbook of Indian Politics, published by Oxford University Press. There is one chapter dealing with secularism. I think that is very useful. Then there is a book by again Oxford University Press, Secularism and its Critiques, editor Rajiv Bhargav. I think that book is also quite useful. And then, as I mentioned, that is still considered a classic work on Indian secularism, Donald D. Smith, Secular State in India, published in 60s, but it still has the same value.
Alright, thank you so much, sir. And friends, with this we bring our lecture to a close. But of course, we need to thank sir first of all. Thank you so much, sir, for being here.
Pleasure.
And thank you, friends. You are an equal and a wonderful contribution to our lectures. So keep watching and stay with us. Thank you so much.